The wars of the gods are a favorite and most terrifying part of mythological memory. The evil wind of Sumer, the astras tearing through the sky in Indian texts, the destructive eye of Egypt that misses no target, and the terrifying divine voice from the heavens mentioned in the Quran, destroying anyone who hears it. What they have in common is that they are all far ahead of their time and, interestingly, contain a great deal of specific detail for a myth or a religious text. And these details are relevant to our modern world. So, is there perhaps a narrative here that goes far beyond myth? Could there be some truly scientific basis behind the wars between the gods themselves, wars that ended in a veritable massacre immediately following the natural destruction of the flood? In our Ancient History series, we saw step by step how pre-flood civilizations were destroyed. Today, we will see how the inhabitants of the world themselves brought about a new destruction immediately after the flood. And at the end of the video, the events will connect to some much more interesting places. Welcome to Finding the Truth. We begin our journey in Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization, and the subject of this video's most interesting scientific discussion. In the scorching deserts of Mesopotamia, texts from the Sumerian and Babylonian civilizations describe a catastrophe far more terrifying than any physical invasion, a malevolent wind. In the Lament for Ur, we encounter a fascinating narrative. The background to this event is, in my opinion, even more remarkable. Because this decision was presented at the Anunnaki Council, and Nana and Ningal vehemently opposed this catastrophe. Enlil, however, harshly closed the matter, saying that Ur had been given kingship, but kingship was never promised to last forever, and then he set the mechanisms of its end into motion. When I describe it like this, it sounds like I'm quoting from one of Zecharia Sitchin's novels, but I promise I'm not doing that intentionally. These are excerpts straight from the epics. Afterward, the malevolent wind, the deadly wind of Ur, is unleashed. The characteristics of this wind are even more intriguing. It is described as an artificial catastrophe that shines on the horizon, emits heat, prevents the sun from rising during the day, and poisons the waters. Zecharia Sitchin, whom I said I wasn't quoting, claims that this evil wind was the radioactive fallout from the destruction of a spaceport on the Sinai Peninsula around 2024 BC, or from the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah by extraterrestrial beings called the Anunnaki, using nuclear weapons. In Sitchin's theories, the fact that no door or wall can stop this wind, and that it wipes out an entire civilization in a single night, perfectly matches the deadly nature of radioactive fallout. I think anyone interested in the subject should read Sitchin's books, but don't forget that he also developed his own theory and made his own interpretations, sometimes venturing into extremes. Since I want to stay grounded on this channel, I address these topics, even the extreme ones, using quotes from the original epics, so as not to muddy the waters. And honestly, in the original myths, the characteristics of this evil wind are already so extraordinary that there's no need for exaggerated descriptions. People collapse to the ground from its mere presence, without being struck. The streets fill with the dead, yet none of them bear any scars. The water becomes poisoned. The fields dry up and never yield crops again. Those who try to escape the wind are struck down like stone the moment it catches them. Their faces darken, and they suffocate to death. Does the story of a prophet's wife, who was told not to look behind her or she would die, yet turned back and collapsed like a pillar of stone, come to mind? Yes. We'll get to that in a moment. It's strange for this era, but at the same time, this extremely specific weapon narrative isn't found only in Sumer. When we turn our eyes to ancient India, we encounter far more terrifying and mechanical descriptions in the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, epics written in Sanskrit. The Battle of Kurukshetra depicts a scene of destruction involving celestial beings, gods beyond ordinary comprehension. The texts describe a gigantic flying vehicle called a vimana, soaring through the sky, emitting a deep thundering sound, and breathing fire. Texts like the Samarangana Sutradhara describe these vehicles as being powered by mercury vortex engines, shining like the sun, and launching laser-like beams from golden-winged missiles. These vehicles are not man-made. They are cosmic war machines designed by the celestial engineer Vishwakarma, and given for the use of the gods. But the pinnacle of this narrative isn't these vehicles at all. It is the unimaginable weapons in the gods' own personal arsenals, weapons they use in battle. Unimaginable, of course, for the people of that era. For us, it's exactly like this. One of the most terrifying weapons in the Hindu epics, the equivalent of an atomic bomb, is the Brahmastra, a weapon designed by the creator god Brahma himself to protect Dharma, the universal order. In the texts, this weapon is described as a single projectile charged with all the power of the universe. It is said to never miss its target once fired, and cannot be stopped by any physical shield, creating a gigantic column of fire and smoke equal to the brightness of 10,000 suns. The epic even states, a column as bright as 1,000 suns rose. The sky darkened. The winds began to wail, and even unborn babies perished in their mothers' wombs. It was as if 10,000 suns had risen at once. A massive, smokeless mass of fire enveloped everything. The sky did not brighten, on the contrary, it became blindingly bright. Birds flying through the air were instantly scorched by the intense heat and fell to the ground. These descriptions are remarkable, and the after effects continue. Those who survived the explosion lost their fingernails, wounds appeared on their skin, water and food became poisonous, and not a single blade of grass grew in the blast area for 12 years. The earth cracked and died. The account of even unborn children dying clearly points us toward one conclusion: this was, unmistakably, radiation poisoning. The only problem is that the dates we're talking about are thousands of years ago. Of course, the extremely detailed descriptions of technological weapons in the Indian epics don't end there. There is an even more advanced and terrifying version of the Brahmastra, the Brahmashirsha Astra, the ultimate weapon of mass destruction, said to represent the 4 heads of Brahma. Its secrets are known only to a handful of elite warriors, such as Drona, Ashvathama, Arjuna, and Karna. These weapons are not activated by a physical trigger, but through deep meditation and mental mastery, achieved by reciting the syllables of the Gayatri mantra in reverse. It is said to contain fire, air, and cosmic poison, and to be extremely heavy, containing mercury. Just as the Brahmastra was like an atomic bomb, the Brahmashirsha Astra is like an antimatter bomb, thousands of times more powerful, described in the epic as operating at the level of cosmic destruction. Another formidable Indian weapon, the Pashupatastra, is the personal weapon of Shiva, the god of destruction. Its use against lesser enemies is strictly forbidden, since it has the capacity to destroy the entire universe in a single blow. The Pashupatastra is described as a gigantic weapon with thousands of heads, thousands of eyes, and thousands of mouths, capable of devouring everything in its path, and it can be launched with the mind, the eyes, a spoken word, or a bow. It's depicted less like a concrete machine and more like an anomaly, something that operates through an abstract, almost coded command. You could even call it a digital weapon of war, a virus. Of course, in the Indian epics, these weapons are described as spiritual as much as mechanical. You can only access them by mastering extremely advanced spiritual disciplines. But here lies the paradox. Why would an enlightened soul, one freed from the trials of the ego, want to unleash something like an atomic bomb? Let's move on. In Egypt, our last stop in the ancient world, we encounter the destructive weapon known as the Eye of Ra. And interestingly, in this narrative, the weapon's operating principles are described in a rare way, almost as if it were an autonomous entity with a mind of its own, artificial intelligence in every sense but the name. The eye is depicted both as a protector and a ruthless destroyer, taking the form of a sun disk or a flame-spitting cobra. Once activated, it can make its own decisions. In some texts, it even argues with Ra himself. It is said that it grew angry with him and fled far away. This is one of the earliest examples in any mythology of a weapon developing a character independent of its operator. Here's how the weapon is described as working. In disc or cobra form, the device detects the enemy and attacks autonomously. In cobra form, a burning fire erupts from its mouth, but the texts call it the fire of the uraeus, meaning it isn't actually fire as we know it, but a form of energy, something closer to a laser. Isn't that a fascinating detail and a curious choice of words? In the famous ancient Egyptian Book of the Heavenly Cow, in the section describing the destruction of humanity, it's said that this weapon once went out of control and literally drenched the ancient world in blood, so violently that even Ra himself couldn't contain it. And once again, alongside this destruction, we see the same invisible effect found in the Sumerian and Indian epics, an illness that spreads like a plague. A complete nuclear fallout narrative. Things take a different turn for many believers today with the spread of the Abrahamic religions across the region. We see this same narrative of destructive weapons, once wielded directly by the gods, reappear as the destructive forces used by angels at the command of God, just as described in the destruction of the tribe of the mud and similar peoples. From a modern perspective, the narratives of destruction found in these sacred texts once again parallel the ancient accounts, spanning a wide range of imagery, from frequency-based weapons to thermonuclear effects. And the main reason for this conclusion is that, in these stories, God doesn't simply cause the destruction by saying, "Be," and having it happen instantly. Instead, these actions are carried out through what read like tactical operations, executed by angels. This alone could lead to a much deeper discussion, but let's not stray from our subject. For example, the Quran mentions a force called the Sayha, a violent sound, a single scream that brought about the end of the people of the mud. They were simply quarreling among themselves, waiting for a single cry to seize them without warning. We sent upon them a single mighty blast, and they became like the dry twigs and branches gathered by a herdsman. This is a striking image, and the Quran presents this concept of a destructive sound descending from the sky in several other places as well. Similarly, the Israelites, using knowledge attributed to God, are said to have brought down the massive walls of Jericho using sound and vibration. And of course, these aren't the only accounts of divine destructive power found in the Quran and other scriptures. The rain of baked clay stones upon the people of Lot, and the destruction of Sodom by sulfur and fire from the sky described in the Torah, are concepts that align remarkably well with the scientific probabilities behind the events we're about to discuss. Keep that in mind. The closest parallel in the Quran to the ancient Mesopotamian narrative of the evil wind is the freezing, howling wind that battered the people of Aad for 7 nights and 8 days, scattering them like the hollow trunks of fallen palm trees. So we sent upon them a screaming, freezing wind through days of misfortune, that we might make them taste a humiliating punishment in the life of this world. And there are lessons in the story of Aad. We sent upon them a violent wind that devastated everything it passed over, reducing it to ashes, leaving nothing untouched. The common thread running through all these narratives is that the destruction described is never simply a natural disaster. It's portrayed as a high-tech punishment system, directed at a specific target, controlled by intermediaries, angels, with a defined duration, and foretold through protocols and warnings. However, the chain of events gets stranger still when we consider this verse, and we have certainly left of it a clear sign for a people who use reason, referring to the land of Lot. As you may know, the Dead Sea region, associated with the people of Lot, lies within the borders of present-day Jordan. And interestingly, in 2021, the journal Scientific Reports published some remarkable findings about an excavation in the region. It revealed that around 1650 BC, the ancient city of Tal el-Hammam was destroyed by a cosmic airburst from the sky. The evidence uncovered was astonishing. Researchers determined that the blast instantly raised the temperature of the area to over 2000 degrees, so intense that the outer surfaces of pottery and ceramics found at the site had become vitrified from the heat. Only two forces on Earth can produce that kind of power: a meteor or an atomic bomb. But let's not leap straight to science fiction, because subsequent analysis found shocked quartz grains and diamond-like carbon deposits scattered throughout the area. And that's not all. Unusually high concentrations of platinum, iridium, and nickel were also found in the local soil layers. When you put all of these clues together, they point to only one explanation. Almost 4,000 years ago, a meteor exploded over an ancient city near the Dead Sea before it ever reached the ground, destroying the city below as if by divine punishment, exactly as described in the Quran. This event also helps explain the strange, barren character of the Dead Sea region today, because an airburst of that scale would have released enormous quantities of salt and sulfur from the Dead Sea and its surroundings, which the wind could easily have carried across the surrounding farmland, rendering it barren and lifeless for generations. The most famous parallel to this kind of event, one that mirrors the Quranic description and strongly suggests a meteor airburst, is the mysterious Tunguska event of 1908. In this incident in Russia, a meteor exploded above a forest, tearing through the atmosphere with a deafening roar and flattening 80 million trees across an area of 2,150 square kilometers, scattering them like dry straw, much like the imagery in that same Quranic verse. Now, you're free to approach this event from whichever angle you prefer. If you like, you can view it purely as described in the Quran, that God willed the destruction of a city, commanded angels to carry it out, and that they destroyed it with a sound or a force sent down from the sky. But here a question arises: why command it through an instant word, and yet have it unfold through intermediaries? Why would an all-powerful being need angels as go-betweens at all? And beyond that, why would such a being want to destroy a city in the first place? These questions can get complicated fast. Or, alternatively, you could combine this with the academic and scientific evidence we just covered, and conclude that a meteor, likely similar to the Tunguska event, exploded over that region roughly 4,000 years ago, devastating the land, and that because the people of that time had no scientific framework to explain it, they attributed it to divine intervention, passed the story down by word of mouth, and it eventually found its way into the Quran. There's even a third possibility, that yes, a meteor caused the physical destruction, but its fall on that particular day was still part of the Creator's will and destiny, meaning the event was both scientific and divine at once. Which explanation you choose really comes down to your own beliefs. But with this piece of the puzzle in place, the scientific part of our journey truly begins. I brought up the Quran earlier for a reason, because now we've reached the point where myth, religion, legend, and science all intersect, and what we find there is genuinely fascinating. The single greatest trait of pre-scientific humanity has been its tendency to attribute divine or mystical causes to events it couldn't otherwise explain. In fact, this is precisely why, in the later stages of polytheistic religion, the belief emerged that everything that moved or struck from the sky had a god behind it. Lightning strikes, fires break out, Zeus must be punishing us. Cyclical floods occur, Poseidon must be angry. Earthquakes level cities, it must be one of Shiva's whims. And so entire generations grew up never questioning anything, attributing every disaster to the will of the gods. The echoes of this pattern continue even today. If you come from an Abrahamic background, you'll recognize this. Despite the Quran's explicit command to use reason, there are still believers who treat science itself as something close to blasphemy, who, when asked why the sky is blue, simply answer, "God willed it, don't question it too much." Do you see the irony? Understanding the Creator, in truth, comes through understanding creation, meaning through science. And once we apply that science, we can look at the extraordinary events described in these thousands of years old accounts of the wars of the gods from a slightly more modern, grounded perspective. We can see this pattern echoed elsewhere too. A situation similar to the Quran, Torah, Sodom and Gomorrah, and meteor connection we just discussed also appears in the Northern Hemisphere, in the misty hills of Scotland, where you'll find so-called vitrified forts, ancient hilltop fortresses said to have been burned by the gods. The stone walls of these massive hilltop structures were subjected to such extreme heat that the stone itself melted, flowed, and then resolidified into glass. The same vitrification process appears in the vast desert on the border between Egypt and Libya, in the Libyan desert glass, a yellow-green glass field made of 99% pure silica, spread across kilometers of sand. Even the striking scarab carving on Tutankhamun's famous breastplate is carved from this mysterious desert glass. Physically, it looks almost identical to the green glass formed in New Mexico after the Trinity test, the site of the first atomic bomb detonation, in 1945. Because of these similarities, for years these two sites were held up as the ultimate proof of a prehistoric nuclear war. Later, however, researchers discovered why the vitrification happened at the Scottish forts. Large timber logs were packed between the massive stones during construction to reinforce them. When an enemy set the fortress ablaze, the energy released by those burning logs, combined with the overall heat of the fire, caused the stones to melt and vitrify at around 1,200 degrees Celsius. So while the Libyan glass does resemble the aftermath of a nuclear blast, there's a clear difference in radioactive isotope signatures between an actual atomic bomb and a meteor explosion, along with a telltale spike in rare metals, much like what was found in the Levant. For this reason, after extensive study, the most widely accepted explanation is that the Libyan desert glass was formed by a large meteor that exploded over the Sahara approximately 29 million years ago. But what about the giant, death-wind, events that made Mesopotamia nearly uninhabitable, wiping out much of its population and reportedly making even the gods regret their own decision? Is there any evidence for that? Yes, actually. Quite a bit. Scientists have identified a massive global climate anomaly that began around 2200 BC, known as the 4.2 kiloyear event. During this period, a terrible megadrought lasting for centuries struck much of the world. The collapse of the Akkadian Empire, the decline of the Sumerians, and the fall of the early civilizations in Scotland all coincide precisely with this same window of time. The infamous invisible, malevolent wind described in Sumerian laments as something that crept in through every gate, turning fresh water into salt and bitter waste, was, according to modern academic interpretation, the consequence of centuries of poor irrigation practices across Mesopotamia, which gradually salinized the soil, compounded by the broader climate crisis the world was experiencing at the time. The drought, the water scarcity, and the poisonous dust storms rising off the parched land were so insidious and deadly that people of that era, lacking any scientific framework, had no way to interpret this slow ecological collapse, this seemingly cursed death of the fields, except as a deliberate biological attack unleashed by an angry god from the sky, Enlil. And that's still not the whole picture. Around 1600 BC, the Santorini supervolcano also erupted, an event significant enough that I made an entire video about it. Because of that eruption, both the civilizations living in the immediate region and, thanks to the massive volume of ash released into the atmosphere, civilizations thousands of kilometers away were affected, and some even collapsed entirely. These events, naturally, were folded into the myths and religious memory of the era as punishment sent down by the gods. And there's one more piece. Around the same millennium BC, researchers uncovered an unusual magnetic anomaly in the Middle East, known as the Levantine Iron Age geomagnetic anomaly. This event is thought to have triggered unusually intense auroras across the Middle East and surrounding regions, caused by fluctuations in the planet's magnetic field. Just think about that for a moment. People who had never witnessed anything like it before, who had no concept of what an aurora even was, would almost certainly have interpreted such a sight in the night sky as something divine. Wouldn't you, in their place? Of course, none of this means every one of these famous tales of the wars of the gods was simply a lie, or that everything has a tidy scientific explanation. Because it's equally true that these war narratives generally describe real events that unfolded in the early centuries after the flood, and as we saw throughout our ancient history series, the myths of the past were not always just myths. So keep your curiosity and your horizons open to these extreme possibilities. But I've also laid out the scientific evidence here so that none of us rushes to turn every strange account into proof of a cosmic war. Let's keep our feet on solid ground, that way, you'll end up doing a much healthier kind of investigation. Ultimately, whether the motif of humanity's punishment after the flood, as described in these ancient epics and echoed across world religions, is literally true or not, one thing is certain: what we actually know about our world in the centuries immediately following the flood remains extremely limited, and more than a little hazy. To glimpse the truth hiding inside that haze, I believe that by combining myth, religious narrative, and science together, we can come a little closer to understanding these lost chapters of human history. And if we manage that, I hope those secrets of the past might end up shedding a little light on our future. Thank you all for watching. As with almost every video, sources and related videos will be waiting for you in the description, and you're always welcome to share your own thoughts in the comments. Please don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel to keep me company on this journey. See you in the next video. Take care.